I hope we focus more on the second part of this title. Yeah, we're definitely going to be talking about arousal. We're going to be talking about training too, though. So, yeah, just be ready for a little bit of everything, guys. But, yeah, I feel like Bryce is the perfect candidate to join me on this topic because back in the day, we're talking 2019, Bryce Calvin. I've seen the guy and I've heard the music he's listened to in the gym. He definitely knows a thing or two about training and arousal. So Hannah says currently doing hacks. Arouse me, please. We'll try our best. No promises out here. But arousal, of course, has a definite place in training. Whether it's hypertrophy or strength training. For hypertrophy, first and foremost, just to give a quick overview, I think to bring in the intensity that you need for certain sets, you got to amp yourself up a little bit. And it definitely helps to understand how that plays into the grand scheme of things. For strength, of course, if you're lifting maximal loads, similarly, you got to really kind of turn up from time to time, whether you're doing a squat 1 rep max or if you're like Bryce where you're just repping RDLs at 700 pounds. She says, is it not appropriate to have my 6-year-old next to me for this combo? No, I don't think we'll get into that kind of arousal. But
maybe that's
6-year-old.
a good point to define what arousal means for training.
Yes, right? Yes. So in this context, we're not talking about arousal that you might hear, but for training, we're talking about getting yourself amped up, getting yourself hyped up, hyper focused. I guess it'd be a high sense of would neural drive fit into this at all, Bryce? Do you consider that? Yeah.
Yeah. So the way that I think of arousal is basically, like you said, just getting yourself amped up for a set. So like that can be like a hormonal drive too. So like think about adrenaline. Like if your adrenaline is pumping and spiking, like you're going to have that like aroused fight or flight type of response. But part of arousal is that you don't want to be aroused at the wrong times, and this goes for training. It also goes for just normal arousal. So I guess that we can kind of like interplay those. But with training, if you're doing a light session, you don't want to be super amped up. You don't need to be super amped up. You want to be able to control that, and you want to be able to like titrate that into your training carefully and strategically, because there is actually a downside to getting too amped up too frequently. And I think that's kind of like what we can talk about, the difference between like hypertrophy and strength.
Yeah, and of course, as it would fit into like a mesocycle design, right? Typically, you might run a 4-to-1 paradigm, 5-to-1 paradigm, whatever your paradigm is. Basically, what I mean by that is you'll start out a little bit on the lighter side, whether it's lighter intensity, less volume. Man, this tree is just really, the shadows are just fucking with me right now. But you'll typically start out a mesocycle a little bit lighter in terms of intensity, I guess mindset intensity, not just load on the bar. And then we'll progressively increase the challenge of the training demands. And that's when definitely you kind of have to use a little bit more arousal techniques for your training to really get the job done. So I feel like that was some good context for the situation. But I guess what has kind of come to mind and what prompted me for this discussion is now that I've switched my goals over to a lot more hypertrophy focus, I employ a lot less arousal techniques than when I was really focused in on strength training. Would you agree with that, Bryce?
Yeah. So there has to be a balance between how hyped up you get versus like what your goals are. So with strength, whenever you're trying to train at like really high intensities, you're training with really high absolute loads. Most of the time, especially with like main movements that you're practicing, you have to have a certain level of like training arousal for that, because you have to basically be practicing what you're going to be doing on a meet day. So if you are training for strength, if you're training for like a powerlifting meet or something like that, that's usually how I think about strength, is you're trying to simulate the conditions that you would be performing under whatever sport you're doing. But it's interesting because strength and power are completely different. So to generate the most power, and I think of something like an Olympic lift, so like a clean and jerk, you actually do not want to be aroused. You want to be very calm. Because if you're too aroused, what that does, that basically just sends tons of neuron signals to your muscles, and you're just overloading, you're flooding all of those like inputs. So you're going to get a lot of contraction strength, but you're not necessarily getting a lot of specific coordination. So So that's great for a very simple uniplanar movement like a squat or a bench or a deadlift, because there's not a lot of complexity within that. But if you're trying to perform something that's very precise, like a clean and jerk, you don't want to be very aroused. You want to be calm because you have to defer back to your technique. So something like hypertrophy falls very in between those, right? Because you are still trying to be specifically exertive. I don't think that's a word, but you're trying to exert your force output very specifically. But you don't want to dump all of your adrenaline. You don't want to just like overload yourself too much to the point where you're spent after like the first 2 or 3 reps. And then once your fatigue starts to build up through that set, you can't maintain that same arousal state for, reps 5, 6, 7, 10, 12 that you were for the first few. So it has to be a very careful balance there with hypertrophy versus strength. And I tend to be a little bit further towards the spectrum of like non-arousal. I try and stay as calm as I can because I don't want to depend on getting myself amped up to perform. I want to be able to perform in as many adversarial conditions as possible, right? Like I don't want to have to depend on the specific and perfect circumstance to be able to perform. And I think that's more of a condition of hypertrophy training versus strength training. I think that strength training can be dependent a little bit more on perfect circumstances, whereas hypertrophy should be more replicable. Is replicable a word?
Oh yeah.
Replicable. We'll go with replicable. Yeah.
Yeah, man. I like that you brought in the specificity component with strength training, powerlifting. It definitely comes to my mind. There's times when you have to really practice those techniques so that you can display your maximal strength on a meet day. But that definitely isn't all the time. And like you said, like kind of being more even keel, probably toward the beginning of a powerlifting peaking cycle, or just day-to-day training. Maybe if you're far away from a meet, same goes for hypertrophy, is definitely the best way to go. One thing that I definitely wanted to cover as well is your thoughts on, I guess, things like smelling salts, things that can kind of like give you the exterior source of arousal, and how that fits into hypertrophy training. We see it all the time within powerlifting, strength training. But do you think there's a time and place for it with hypertrophy?
Yeah, so you can list like smelling salts, extremely loud, aggressive music, environmental things. So I guess music falls into that, but also like a really, really hyped up crew, a crowd, someone slapping you in the face. Like those are all types of like external arousal variables. I think that with hypertrophy training, yeah, you could potentially lean into those a little bit more in specific circumstances. Like maybe if you're at the end of a training cycle, you're really going for like rep PRs, volume PRs, that like on the other end of that training cycle, that training week, that microcycle, whatever you're doing there, you're probably going to have like a period of like fatigue reduction. So maybe like a deload. I think that's an okay time to really lean into those external variables a bit more. But I don't think that should be something that's consistently done. Like I said, I think that you should be able to like internally find those motivational factors and translate that into like your own consistent baseline arousal. And then very strategically, if you need those things, like if you need someone to come in and slap you in the face to get you excited for a lift, like towards the end of your training cycle, I think that's okay. But if you're trying to do that at like, week 1, you're probably not going to be able to sustain that output for 4, 5, 7, 8, 12 weeks. It's just not super realistic. So I would say that if you're going to do it for hypertrophy training, maybe do it towards the very end of your training cycle when you absolutely need it, but don't lean into it too often. Like that's just a recipe for disaster, I think.
Yeah. I really like that point that you made. And I think it just goes to show at times people can kind of get addicted to that hyped up feeling, whether they're training with a group or, training with just a training partner even. It can be a lot of fun, but you have to know that there's a time and place for it, and that you might not be able to recover if you're always going balls to the wall with screaming in your training partner's ear, really hyping them up. There might be a point of diminishing returns there. So it's important to notice that. And I've definitely kept that in mind as I've had like a consistent training partner over the past 2 mesocycles. Like I won't be talking as much shit at the beginning of our training blocks, just trying to keep it a little bit more even keel, like you mentioned.
Well, I think an example of this too is like, I'm sure everybody's had these sessions where they're either in like an environment or they're around a group of people or they're maybe training with someone that they really want to impress, and they have like this fucking awesome training session. It's like a memorable one where they go in and like polish PRs, like they just crush the entire workout, like they leave, they're just like dragging themselves out, like they didn't know they could even train that hard. But you can't really replicate that on your own, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's good for very specific instances, but if you can't replicate something, if you can't like take a performance and consistently do it and consistently build on it throughout the entire like course of a mesocycle or training cycle or whatever you're trying to do there, I don't think it's super beneficial to lean into or expect that that's going to be a baseline that you can build from. I think that like if you're trying too hard to find those external like motivating factors or at the external arousal points, you're probably going to be a little bit too up and down with your performance to get anything positive from that over like the long term.
Yeah. Just yesterday even, I headed back to Ohio, home with the parents, and my training partner, Alyssa, texted me. We typically hit legs on Friday. She's like, this is about to be hell without you here. And I was like, that's not good. Like, it shouldn't be like that. So,
right.
Yeah, that's a great point to make, man. Let me ask you this, Bryce. Have you ever put any thoughts into periodizing your arousal, or do you not really even worry about that? Such as, like, I guess I'll give examples, like focusing on like really hard and heavy music. Maybe you're employing some of that Sullivan King, some Sun and Death, some Rez maybe toward the end of a mesocycle, or do you not even really worry about that?
That's just background noise in my life anyway, so like that's just there. I don't like that's
constantly just going on.
But I think that's actually a really interesting question because there have been times whenever I've tried to use strategies that have been more geared towards like potentiation of output. I actually have tried to perform potentiation sets. I don't know, have you ever tried that before?
Yeah.
So if someone is like watching this and they're not familiar with what that is, basically you perform either like a heavy set or a high velocity set or a high power set. I guess all of those can kind of be linked together anyway before you go into like your actual working set volume, right? So like for me, what I would do is whenever I was trying this out, let's say I was doing deadlifts, I would go and do like a single deadlift at like, 110 or 115% of the working weight I was planning to use for like a set of 5 or 6. And my intention there was basically to prime my nervous system for the next sets, like the lower absolute load that I was going to be using with my working set so that my nervous system was ready to perform and it was ready for that output. What I found was that the increased arousal from those like heavy potentiation sets actually basically decreased my ability to perform on subsequent sets because I had just dumped my adrenaline and I got too amped up for the heavy potentiation set. So from that whole experience, I learned that like I do a lot better whenever I'm calm. Like if I'm too amped up before a set, I'll fuck up. I will not be able to perform that well. So I have to stay calm, and I have to actually like think my way through my sets. And for the same reason there is like I can't perform things like too explosively. So like with a deadlift as another example, right? Like if I'm trying to like rip a deadlift off the floor, it won't work for me. I have to like ease into the tension and just slowly grind and drive it off of the floor. If I try and pull too hard, if I try and like explode into it, I just get pulled out of position. So that's just been my experience with like these like really, really high arousal states going into training. It doesn't work very well for me. So like if I were to do a powerlifting meet, I would not be the person that just get like slapped in the face and like screaming at people and shit. Like that would not be me. I couldn't do that. I have to focus on what I'm doing. But I also understand there are certain people that like really leverage those external arousal points. So yeah, I don't know. What about you? Have you ever like really tinkered or experimented with that stuff?
Yeah, I actually, like at one point I made like multiple playlists of like RPE 7, RPE 9, like it was fucking nerdy. That's about all I can say about it now. But honestly, I go back to this playlist sometimes. I'm like, dang, this is kind of a banger. I need to get back on this. But you you brought up like the perfect example with powerlifting and with some of those things that relates back to one of the readings you had us do for the internship from the CSCS book, with like the psychology of coaching, I believe, was the section. And basically like the higher skill component, there is, well, I guess there was three factors. I think it was like the skill component of the task involved, the level of the lifter, and then the like level of arousal or the amount of like mental energy they could dedicate toward it. And like the more advanced lifter, I think, can incorporate more arousal techniques, but that takes a lot of work and a lot of practice to be able to balance the two. Whereas like if you're maybe doing your first powerlifting meet and you're trying to get super psyched up, like you said, like technique breakdown will likely occur and shit just might hit the fan. So you really have to be selective, I guess, about when to employ those or when to employ those with your clients if you're looking at it from a coaching perspective.
Yeah, and I think it was from the same section in that book, or maybe it was something else that I read. But there is also a balance between arousal state and ability to problem solve and ability to think through things. So the best example I can think of is like football. So I don't know how many people have actually played football like on a higher level, but going into a football game, like you're always highly aroused. Like you're always really, really amped up. Everybody has like butterflies in their stomach. You're really a little bit nervous until like you get hit. But you can't actually think through things very well whenever you're that amped up. So like football is a game of a lot of like problem solving. It's a lot of like looking at the people in front of you and estimating or like, you know, taking probabilities of like what's going to happen next. You have to really think things through, and you have to base that off of like your prior experiences, like things that you've seen, things that you've studied. So if you're always amped up playing football, for example, you can't actually think things through. Like there's nothing going on in your brain. You're just wired as fuck. So you have to actually remain calm. And that's typically why like the best quarterbacks in football are the ones that can stay the most calm, because they can actually see what's happening in front of them, and their brain can make those quick decisions, those quick reflexive decisions that need to happen if you see a receiver flash open. Like they can read what's going on in front of them. And same thing, you know, if you're doing a heavy set of clean and jerks or a heavy snatch, you need to be able to course correct if it calls for it. So you have the initial pull, but after that, there's a lot of like very, very, very subtle course corrections that are going on between the time that you catch it and the time that, you know, you are dropping under it for a snatch or whatever it might be. So, so a lot of that has to do with being calm and experience with those different arousal states and figuring out like what exactly you operate best under. And that's not easy for a lot of people to find.
Yeah, dude. Well, I feel like we definitely hit that pretty well. To give a quick summary, people love this in the comment section. What's up, Hunter?
I know, yeah. As arousal rather than training, we might have just gotten a ton of people.
Right. Hey, part two.
Part two, yeah.
Quick summary. If you're just now joining, I think it's definitely arousal for various training styles has to be different, right? I think, like we said, like for hypertrophy training, it's probably not a great idea to employ a ton of arousal. Use it sparingly. For strength training, like powerlifting specifically, there's definitely a specificity component involved. You know, make sure that you can still perform the technical aspect of the lift, but it should probably be there 100% for meet day if you're advanced enough. And then for very technical sports, Olympic lifting, football, you know, tons of like, I guess more mainstream sports have a more technical component than just lifting weights. But you really have to have a careful balance between the two. He says hypertrophy training definitely arouses me. CrossFit does not. Man, who knows what CrossFitters do with arousal? That just sounds like an injury waiting to happen.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just think that like as a quick example, you know, being too frequently aroused in training, it is very detrimental, to be honest. Like if anybody has ever had like an experience during a meet, like during a really, really important powerlifting meet, the next day you feel like you got hit by a fucking bus. Like it's not just because of the training you did, it's also because of how amped up you were the entire day. And like typically people just absolutely crash after that, because once you're amped up, like whenever you're in that fight or flight state for so long, your body just crashes after that. It just dumps all that adrenaline, and then you can't sustain that. So you don't want that experience whenever you're trying to consistently perform through the course of like a hypertrophy mesocycle. You want consistent baseline. And that's, I think, the most important thing. If you need to spike up towards the end, that's okay. But you don't want these like periods of extreme spike up with arousal and then like, an arm day the next day, and then extreme spike up the next day with arousal for like a leg day, and then back down for like an accessory ab day. Like you don't want that to be happening, because you're not going to be able to sustain your performance for very long.
Yeah, dude. Very well put. Mic drop real quick. Boom. Well, yeah, man, I appreciate you coming on once again. Definitely a good talk, and definitely a more nuanced conversation, but it's a good one to have. So, yeah, dude, any other thoughts?
No, I think that's it. I think that's all I got.
Awesome. Thank you guys for checking it out, and share it around if anybody that's interested in arousal and training. Probably should make that caveat. But all right, Bryce, I'll see you, man.
All right, dude. See ya.